Chapter 14, The Coming of War, What Events Caused World War II and How Did the U.S. Become Involved? When we look at this first section, it's going to talk about the events in Europe between the Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference, and the years leading just up to World War II. So it's called Dictators in War. So why did these totalitarian states arise? And what did they do? And so we're going to see a number of different ones. I know students in the past have struggled with totalitarian and also fascism. So make sure you're kind of looking at those terms and understanding what they mean, and not just like the definition of them, because that's not going to really help you much. You really need to understand how they work and what the key elements of them are. So we'll look at these dictators and the regimes in several countries in the 30s. We'll look at how these regimes are taking aggressive actions throughout Europe and Asia, and maybe some of the reasons why. And then the response that Great Britain, France, and the United States has. So when we look at what enables these dictators and these totalitarian governments to arise, a lot of it can be traced back to World War I. When you look at the map of Europe, 1914, and then you look at the map of Europe, 1923, Europe is a much different place. And so some of these really old empires that had existed for centuries are split up into new countries. And these new countries really don't have the institutions, they don't have the traditions, they don't have the backgrounds. And so they're starting really from scratch. And that's kind of a tough thing to do. And then you throw in there this economic crisis, the Great Depression, and they're just not equipped. I mean, the United States, that had been around for, by that point, 100 plus years, struggled with the Great Depression. And there was talks about, tearing up the systems and starting all over there. So this is going to be a really tough thing for new countries to deal with. The other real problem here is, at least from German's perspective and even from the Italian perspective, this was a peace treaty that was shoved down people's throats really by like Great Britain, France, and the United States. That those three countries were the ones who created this thing and forced everybody else to deal with it. And there's going to be a lot of resentment that comes from that. So if we look at the 1920s, this decade that began with this promise of democracy and freedom, that Japan, Germany, a lot of these places are beginning democratic governments, and they're going to give people freedom of expression, and they're going to do all those types of things. And what's going to really emerge from this hopes of democracy and freedom, because these places really aren't equipped to adapt and adopt democracy right away, totalitarianism is going to arise. And when you look at totalitarianism and the key traits of it, really there's either one person or one party. And a lot of times it is one party who is being dominated by one individual. That's kind of how this really works. And they're going to control all aspects of life. And they're going to use intimidation, they're going to use fear, they're going to use indoctrination, they're going to brainwash people, they're going to censor information, they're going to control what people think, what people have access to, what people do for a living. It is all aspects of a person's life is controlled by this person or this party. So when we look at several different ones that are popping up around the time, in the Soviet Union, it is communism, but really Stalin is the head of the Communist Party, and he's the one who is leading his vision of what communism should look like. When you look at his 5-year plan, these are a series of plans that he's going to institute that he is hoping will make Russia, Soviet Union, go from a backwards technological place, industrial place, and move them forward and catch up to the rest of the world. And the reason it's going to take a series of these is they're so far behind that he needs really 2 or 3 of these 5-year plans. The problem is in order to do that, he has to intimidate and threaten, and in some cases kill people who are resistant to this. The Great Purge and the Great Terror, kind of the same thing. Stalin goes through these periods of killing sprees where he's killing his own people. It's hard to really know how many, but he ends up killing an awful lot of people throughout his career who are resistant or too slow or aren't getting with the program like he would like. When we look at Italy, Mussolini is able to, again, take advantage of what he felt was a broken promise. Well, not felt, it was a broken promise. The Allies had promised Italy some lands on the Adriatic after World War I, and they never got those lands. And when Italy goes into a whole series of economic problems, Mussolini is able to kind of mix these two things, this feeling like they had been slighted by the great powers, along with these economic problems where no one is stepping up to dealing with them or not dealing with them very well. And Mussolini offers these very simple solutions to these problems and is actually able to be fairly effective. And one of the things that he does is he's tying the present growth of Italy to some of their past greatness. And that's where this fascist party comes in. He goes to this idea that the Roman legion carried these fascists, this bundle of sticks here with an axe on it. And what he starts telling the Italian people is that individually you're a stick and you can be broken. But when you bind a series of sticks together, you become unbreakable, invincible. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to convince Italians that you need to give up your individual identity. You need to buy into my system, and we're going to recreate the next great Roman Empire. And so when you look at the characteristics of fascism, they're different across the globe because you have different cultures, you have different leaders, you have different traditions, and they're going to take fascism and kind of mold it to their own individual country's needs. But essentially, fascism is an awful lot like totalitarianism, that you are going to control all aspects. You're going to control what people think. You're going to control what people hear. You're going to try and brainwash them. You're going to use secret police to intimidate and threaten people. And everything is going to go to the good of the nation. So this extreme nationalism, and it's extremely militaristic. It's very expansionistic. You need to prove to the rest of the world that your country is better than all the other countries. In Germany, Hitler's going to walk into a very similar situation. The Weimar Republic is a brand new democracy. It's not equipped to deal with the problems both of the Great Depression and also problems that are resulting from this peace treaty. And one of those factors is these reparations, these payments that Germany has to make to other countries. Because they don't have enough money and they lost a lot of their industrial capacity when they took lands from them at the end of World War I, they really don't have a way to generate the kind of money they need to pay people back. So they start to print more and more money. And what that does is that leads to inflation, and basically the Deutschmark is going to become essentially worthless. Hitler early on in 1923 is going to try and overthrow the German government. That's not very successful, and he gets arrested and he spends about a year in jail where he writes Mein Kampf, and this is going to become It's My Struggle, and this is where he's going to kind of go through and explain what his view and vision of Germany is, and he also expresses his anti-Semitic views. And so pretty early on, we see the Weimar Republic struggling. One of the things that he learns from that attempt in 1923 is that he probably rushed too much. The German people weren't quite ready for it. So he spends the next 10 years slowly building up the Nazi Party. And he's going to consolidate his power within that Nazi Party. He begins to use the secret police to intimidate his enemies, to threaten the free press, to control the messages, to label the press as the enemy of the people, that they are really portraying him in a bad light, and that's not accurate. And so once he gains control of the media and then also the education system, he's able to really start limiting the messages that the German people get. And he's able to kind of start brainwashing some of the kids, and he's going to build this system that is really going to be beholden to him and is almost going to like emperor worship him when he's able to finally control and gain control of the power. So this is going to take a long time. In Japan, things are a little bit different. They were moving towards a democracy. The Great Depression gets in the way of that. And what ends up happening is then Japan turns to probably the strongest institution within Japan, and that's the military. So the military is going to take back control, and they're going to essentially create a dictatorship where Hideki Tojo is the head of this. And everything else is going to kind of take a back seat. And once you get that, the military kind of in the position that it needs to be, is they're going to begin to expand. And the expansion really are these three key things. They need natural resources to keep fueling its military and industrial juggernaut that's kind of being created here. Again, extreme nationalism, the idea that they're superior to everybody else in Asia. And the other thing is they want to prove to the Western powers that they are as equal to them and that they can act like them and they can be imperialistic like them. And so those are the motives for Japan kind of spreading outward. One of the places that they're going to target is China and Manchuria. Those are both energy rich in terms of needing iron and coal and oil and some of those types of things. But also if they can take over China, the most populous nation in the world, again, that's proof of their abilities and their superiority. When they go into China, they create a number of atrocities, or they commit a number of atrocities, and this becomes known as the Rape of Nanjing. And when you look at current geopolitical workings, to this day, China still uses the weight of history, this Rape of Nanjing, to deal with Japan. And so it's something that China reminds Japan of periodically to throw a little salt in the wound, but also to manipulate them politically into maybe not having as many demands of China as Japan would like to have. They hold this over their heads. So when the dictators are watching all of this happen, they're really wondering what's going to happen with the League of Nations. And what they see is the League of Nations is powerless. And it's powerless for the reasons that are up there. And so little by little, bit by bit, they're going to become more aggressive. And Hitler is going to violate the Paris Peace Conference Treaty. He's going to begin to remilitarize. He's going to begin to slowly expand outward and regain some of those territories lost. And what you see on this poster is, this was put out by the Nazi Party, and it was meant to demonstrate how overcrowded Germany was, and that they needed what they called Lebensraum, living room. They needed to expand outward so they weren't so crunched in. And then they're using France and Great Britain and showing how much room that they have. They don't have nearly the population, or they're not consolidated in as small a territory as Germany is, and to move people into thinking it's okay to kind of expand. Italy is going to target Ethiopia. That's going to be where they're going to try and expand outward and gain some colonial powers. And really the big test here is when we get to the Civil War in Spain. Franco is a fascist. He wants to create a government much like Mussolini and Hitler. And for Hitler and Mussolini, but more importantly probably Hitler, is they see this as an opportunity to test drive their new military machine. So they view this as kind of a scrimmage, a test for their military to see if it's as effective and efficient as they kind of hope, and that's going to maybe embolden them a little bit to move to become a little bit more aggressive and take steps to begin World War II. The way the countries react is appeasement. They're just going to avoid war at all costs. The other thing is they also believe that the Soviet Union and Stalin are the bigger threat, and so they're more worried about that than they are maybe Germany and Hitler. And the other thing is they see Hitler and Germany as kind of this buffer between them and the Soviet Union. So if there is this worldwide worker revolution, they're going to have to go through Germany first. For the United States, we're more focused on what's happening at home. We're kind of ignoring everything else that's going around us. except for a few people in the government. They're the ones who are kind of taking note and getting worried and beginning to think about maybe the future here. But the vast majority of Americans want to be blissfully ignorant of the things that are going on and keep themselves isolated and cut off from the rest of the world's problems. For Hitler, he's going to continue to kind of up the ante to see where the line in the sand is going to be drawn. So when you look at Anschluss, what this is the annexation of some of these territories that once belonged to Germany. And this expansion kind of begins to freak out Great Britain and France. So they meet with him in Munich. And at this Munich conference, Hitler agrees to not take any more territory, that he's done, he's going to stop. And Chamberlain comes home and declares that he has achieved peace for their lifetime. And so they're hoping that this has avoided World War II and that everything's going to be hunky-dory from here on out.